Real kings know how to win positions like that, and today you're about to learn the two simple rules that will make sure you'll always play such positions properly and win. Let's talk about the current position. How would you play here if you were white? Now, there is a deceptive feeling that you need to push your pawn forward because fundamentally that's how you win this endgame. You do wish this bright future for your pawn. And that is why we intuitively wish to just push it forward, and that is already a mistake that just leads to a draw. So here's the first rule. Your king leads the way. Your king needs to be in front of the pawn, which again sounds controversial because normally you do not wish to blockade your pawn, you'd wish to move it forward, but no, your king leads the way. Think of it this way, you gotta put the horse before the car. And in this case, this driving force is actually your king. Your king is the one who is taking control of the squares and making sure that your pawn is able to move forward. Like a more romantic explanation of the same idea is imagine your king is walking the pawn down the aisle to make it his new queen. Maybe you'll love that more. Either way, you gotta put your king before the pawn. That's the most foundational, most important idea of all these endgame positions. And the current situation is one of those positions which are always easy to win for white. And it's useful to remember that as soon as you get your king on the 6th rank in front of the pawn, you're winning. It doesn't matter whose turn it is now, it doesn't matter the opposition, nothing matters. It doesn't matter where your pawn is located across this file. It doesn't matter where your opponent's king is. If it's not there, not blockading the pawn, it's even easier for you to win. So nothing matters. As soon as you reach this position, you are winning the game. If it's black to play, you'd have to move to the side, either left or right, doesn't matter. And then you can just advance your king even further, because again, the king leads the way. And now your king controls all the squares in front of the pawn, which means that there is nothing, and particularly that king cannot stop the pawn from running forward, and it's gonna happen on the next moves no matter what. It's pretty simple, you queen and win. Alright, so far we talked about black having to make a move, giving you space to advance forward. What if it's white to play here? Again, your victory here is still pretty simple, you just play most natural moves. Now, your king cannot advance further because of the opponent's king, therefore you need to move to the side of the pawn, and after he does the same, then you just push the pawn forward. So you go c6 and then c7, and we squeeze the king out here. It can go here or here because of your pawn, can go here because of your king, therefore it has to move to the side, which again allows you to advance your own king forward, and on the next move, you promote a new queen, and after that, you know what to do, right? You stalemate your opponent and write in comments that my teaching does not work. In this position, your pawn is far behind. Is that a problem? No, because as we know, as soon as your king entered the 6th rank in front of the pawn, it is always a win for you, no matter what, right? Therefore, if your king is far behind, you just push it forward. If c4 on the first move is called an English opening, I suppose now it is English closing, because you're about to close the game. And now after a couple more moves, we basically reach the same situation. We squeeze the king out, promote the new queen, and win the game. There is one caveat though. It rarely works out with Helen or Amy. Like, it doesn't matter if your king is on the 6th rank or not, it is still a draw. The issue here is, after we try to apply the same technique, at some point we're reaching this position where we can squeeze the king out of here because there is an edge of the board here. We'd wish this king to move right, somewhere there, but there is just no space there. And therefore the best you can achieve is a stalemate. Now we know what you're aiming for. You wish your king to be on the 6th rank, hopefully in front of the pawn. And as we know our goal, you now start thinking about the origin story. How do you get there, right? So we wish the king to move forward. We know that the king should lead the way. And we have a couple moves forward. Probably king c4 or king d4. Like, which one to pick? There isn't, again, one important rule, basically just the second rule that you need to know. Let's try out king d4 first. In this case, your opponent, if he's smart, he'll try to keep control over these squares, not letting your king to advance further, and therefore he'll go king d6. And now you can't go any further, and if you try moving to the side, he just does the same, and then, again, there is still no way for your king to go forward. Ultimately, you'll have to push your pawn, and that would violate the first and most critical rule, that your king should lead the way, and he should be in front of the pawn. Which brings us to the second key rule, which is called opposition. It is when you approach and face your enemy directly and he chickens out and runs. And it doesn't matter for us whether he retreats or goes to the side or hides behind trees. It doesn't matter. What's important is that you establish your dominance, you seize that space, and you make sure that your upcoming queen is safe and good to go. At this point, black is in Zugzwang. They have to make a move and give you that space. What can they do? If they go backward in any direction, that's good for us, because we know that our goal is to advance our king. That's why if they retreat, you just advance your king forward after that, and that's exactly what we want. If your opponent tries to maintain his king across the 6th rank and go somewhere there to the side, to d6 or to b6, then what it allows us to do is to still move your king forward. We're still using the same principle. Your king leads the way. In this case, you can just outflank your opponent, but still you're moving forward because you wish to advance to one of these 2 squares, right? And if his king goes to the other side, you just again go zigzag, you outflank him, and you still move your king forward. And now they're again at the crossroad. They got to do something. If they try to move forward, that's never a problem, because from here, their king does not blockade your opponent from moving forward, and you can just do that. Therefore, they'll probably try to do something else and retreat backwards. But as they do so, you can keep winning the opposition, keep forcing the king out, and keep outflanking him. And again, you just do what you wish to do. You want to bring your king to the 6th rank. And as soon as you're there, you win the game. Because after this, let's say they go somewhere, for simplicity, you can just put your king to c6 and reach that ultimate winning position that we're aiming for. Your king on the 6th rank in front of the pawn, and we know that it wins no matter what. After this, you don't even have to think about opposition anymore, because it just wins. All right, so whoever is decide to move now, we just use most natural moves and we win the game. The good news is that the opposition is a universal principle, universal rule that applies to any kind of pawn endgames, even if there are more than one pawns on the board. Like in this position, if it's white to move, which move would you play? You need to face your enemy, right? You go king c5, you approach and face your enemy. And that allows you to outflank him. If black goes left, you go right, approach these pawns and capture them. If black goes right, you then can outflank them. You go king d5, once again, insisting on the opposition. And after this, king c6. You advance forward, that's what you want. Your opponent cannot move forward because of your pawn. And if he goes anywhere else, you keep outflanking him. And ultimately, your opponent will have to move away. And then you can just grab one pawn, then you can grab the other one, and you win the game. By the way, let's not stop here. Because again, I've seen many examples when people mess up even when position looks totally winning. But the beauty of knowing foundational positions that we learned today is that you can always transition to them from more complex situation. If let's say you had 2 rooks also on the board, you can trade them off and aim for the winning position that you know. Such as in this case, although you've got 2 pawns, but I'd recommend that you just treat it as a 1-pawn endgame that you know. Right, and only use the 2nd pawn if you need to win a tempo. For example, here, if it's black to play, they do something, you can advance the pawn, you can advance here, advance the pawn, and only here, if you realize that playing king to f6 would lead to a stalemate, you use this pawn just to win a tempo, right? You play g5, squeeze the king out, and after this you can advance, and on the next move promote a queen and win. Why do I recommend you to only move your 1 pawn forward and aim for positions that you are well familiar with? Let's look at this example. Here you've got 2 passers very close to the promotion, and it looks like it should be easily winning for white. But you can't imagine how often people draw on this easily winning position. So let's try to advance the king. Move the king forward, he goes away, we move here, and all of a sudden it's a stalemate. Alright, let's try another approach. Let's move one of our pawns forward. So we move here, he goes forward, now we go here, he goes back, and at this point usually players either run around not knowing what to do, or they choose between king c6 and king a6, and this is the only known situation when chess players swear more than rappers. That is exactly the reason why I recommend that you only move 1 pawn forward, does not care about the other one, and only use the 2nd one to win a tempo if you need so. We know that it rarely works out with Amy, therefore you pick Betty and work her down the aisle. I feel like today's going to be the greatest drop of Amy subscribers of the channel. Anyways, so you move the pawn forward, you just ignore the other one, you pretend like you only have one, and as soon as you need to win a tempo somewhere down the line, you then move the other pawn forward, right? And after this, you squeeze the king and you win the game. Alright, going back to the most critical position of these pawn endgames, how would you play here if you're white? Once again, we know that the king should lead the way. You gotta go king c6. and then you win the game. But your opponents will often play a more natural move. They'll try to advance their passer, they'll play pawn c6, which is wrong, and now I cannot win this position anymore. However, of course, black needs to know how to defend properly. Therefore, how do you do that if you're playing black and you need to save this position? What would you play here if you're black? By the way, today we're only talking about pawn endgames, and if you wish my complete blueprint of chess mastery, you may go to my free masterclass by clicking the link below the video in the description. The rule for black is very simple. You just wish to keep your king in front of the pawn and keep blockading it, as long as you can. And it kind of makes sense, because indeed you do wish to blockade the pawn. You can even pre-move these two moves, king c7, king c8, and play it as much as you can. So you go king c7, whatever he does, you go king c8, whatever he does, you go here, whatever he does, you go here. And only if white approaches with his king forward, and now you can't play this move, you then use the opposition rule. And again, you prevent your opponent from advancing his king forward, which means that he'll have to push the pawn forward in some case. If he goes back, no, it doesn't matter. You just go back to your king c8, king c7 thing, right? But at some point, he'll have to try to advance his pawn. And if he goes forward, you can't go here anymore. So you win the opposition, you go king d8. And after c7, king c8, the only thing he can achieve is a stalemate. Now let's talk about the origin story. And of course, as we discussed earlier, the pawn may be on any line, doesn't really matter, it'll work the same way. So here we know that white wants his king to lead the way, to move forward. And therefore black wants to stop this by keeping his own king on these two squares, which would prevent white from moving forward. Therefore at some point white will have to push the pawn forward, and then we just blockade it. So as black, you wish to keep the king in front of the pawn on these two squares as long as you can. And then if at some point white tries to advance forward, now you can't go here anymore, therefore you win the opposition. And so the situation repeats itself a couple more times. Again, here you win the opposition, white has to move the pawn forward, you go here, here, you go back. Now you go back to c7 and c8 all the time, no matter what white does, and at some point they will have to move the king forward, and then you win the opposition. Because you're smart and because it just happened automatically. And after this, after c7 and king to c6, that is a stalemate and black saved the game. Now let's analyze a slightly different situation. As you can see, fundamentally there are just those two rules, right? You want your king to lead the way, to be in front of the pawn, and the second rule is to win the opposition. That is it. That allows you to play any of similar sort of positions easily. And how do you squeeze this if you're playing white? Theoretically, it's a draw because your king is not in front of the pawn. But nevertheless, practically, your opponents will mess up and you can definitely win. How do you do that? Well, we know that, ideally speaking, white wishes his king to be in front of the pawn. So you wish to advance it forward to either e3 or f3. But what to do if you can't do that? Well, you can just wait a little bit. You can move around for a little while, just hoping for your opponent to go wrong. And practically, that is a nice thing to do. So instead of just advancing the pawn forward, you can let your opponent go wrong. So you can go here and waste some time, but we're not just wasting time, we're in fact waiting for your opponent to go wrong, because they are not familiar with these rules and they can easily pick the wrong idea. Like, what should black play at this point? There's only one move that saves the game for black, and any other move would lose, because we know that white wants to advance the king to one of these two squares. Therefore, black needs to be sure that they control these both squares. And there is only one move that can do so, that is king to d4. But if they go to any other direction, then you get what you want. If they go back, then finally you can advance your king and get to this situation where you won the opposition, your king is in front of the pawn, that's all you want from life, and from now you're totally happy, prosperous, etc. Now, if your opponent goes to the side, you can also outflank him now and you get the same thing. If he goes to the side, you can still outflank him. At some point, he'll go there, you can stand in front of the pawn and you successfully advance your king forward, and that's what you want. You want your king to be right there on the 6th rank, reaching our main winning position. All right, let's go back. So, going back here, the only correct move for black would be king d4, where he keeps controlling these two squares, not letting you move forward. Therefore, at some point, well, I'll have to push the pawn forward, and then we go here. Now, what should black do? Well, in this position, it doesn't really matter that much, but fundamentally, I'd recommend you to keep the king along these two squares, right in front of the pawn, so you keep blockading it for as long as you can. So for black, you go here, and if white goes here, you win the opposition, you go king f5. At some point, white will have to move the pawn forward, and then after this, you go king e3. Now, in these positions, just like I said before, it makes sense for white to not just push the pawn forward in the most straightforward fashion, but to instead waste some time and move around just a little bit, because you hope for your opponent to go wrong, and sometimes they will, because if they don't play the correct move, any other move, would lose the game, and you're really hoping for this. So you let them go wrong by, perpetuating the same situation over and over again. But if they are always playing right, at some point you'll have to keep pushing the pawn for black. In such cases, they want to keep the king in front of the pawn along these two squares. So if white just wastes time, black should not go there. Should go across these two squares, and then you just wait. Whatever white does, you just wait. You stand on these two files. As soon as white advances, you then win the opposition. At some point, white will have to push. And then, if white goes forward, again, you keep the king in front of the pawn along these two squares. If you're playing black, you just do that. If you're playing white, you want to squeeze it. So you keep wasting time. You can try it out. Go here. If he goes right, don't push the pawn forward. That's instant draw. So you can instead go back and try it out a little more. So maybe your opponent will go wrong in some case, and then you'll win the game. If he goes right, going back, that is going to be a draw, because here in this case black wins the opposition, white has nothing to do, and that leads to a stalemate. So that is in a nutshell how this whole situation works out. What can you do in order to squeeze the win if you're having a pawn, and how to defend the position if you're playing black. And here is a little test for you. Please think about this. It is white to play and win, and if you can't find the right solution, please write it down in comments below. Today we talked about Endgame solely. If you wish to have my complete blueprint of chess mastery, go to the free masterclass by clicking the link up there. And another question that people often ask me is how to study chess properly. Like, should you study openings, middle game, end game, solve tactics, etc. And what to do if you only have limited time that you can allocate for chess. I've got this video that answers this question, chess study plan to reach 2000 ELO faster. Check it out.